Hello, Joe. It's great to see you again. I'm here with Disruption Joe. I was hoping that you would be willing to introduce yourself and talk about what you've worked on in the past and what you're currently working on.
Yeah, it's great to be here talking with you. I always admire your ability to convey some really complicated ideas and impress people with math all the time. My journey through the crypto space has been from starting a meetup in 2017 that grew to 4,000 members and leveraged that into a conference company, which was going well until 2020 when COVID hit. After that, you get into an events company. And so I joined the GitCoin team, helping them to expand their capabilities. At the time, there were mostly developers on the team. I started running the grants operations, the Grants Round 8, and ran those for a bit, helping to get us to the next level. As that was happening, we decided to launch the DAO and have the community own some of these more subjective decisions that need to be made in grants rounds. Excited to be on the forefront. So I was the first person to leave the company and go start a work stream in the DAO, the fraud detection and defense work stream, where as the operations person from the Gitcoin team, I ended up being the only person who was really like in the middle of contractors we hired to help deal with the Sybils defense problem, which really stuck its head out after we introduced ZK Sync in layer 2. So there was low gas fees. And you know, the team and the developers getting the work done. So it was an interesting ride with the FDD, which I just wrapped up final season with them. We're doing what I like to think of as a graceful wind down. It just seemed with the protocol coming out and where we were at and building things that there was going to be a time either this season or the next season where it made sense to start using the open source tools that we built. And with the protocol and many round managers out there, fraud detection, what we had been doing for the centralized database as a service that was paid for by the DAO was now the responsibility of the round owners. So that's where we sit now. Is that closed down at the end of last month, and I took a cruise for the first time ever to make no decisions, and then spent some time in MetaCamp in Costa Rica with a bunch of DAO people, really deep diving what's going on, but still enjoying a vacation and not planning to start with my next venture until the end of this month.
Cool. Well, I've been interested in DAOs for a really long time. And I feel that there's a lot of discussion right now where people may be questioning the efficacy of DAOs compared to traditional structures. I was wondering your thoughts in terms of how is a DAO different than a company? What best practices do you think are in common between the two? And what do you think are some things that are unique to the challenges of the DAO structure that people should be aware of?
I mean, the DAOs that I respect most are Bitcoin and Ethereum. These are decentralized because the consistency of their issuance or allocation of rewards is hard-coded, and it can only be changed by the voice of the people who are participating in the protocol. So most of the DAOs, you know, they gave a pre-mine allocations out to this group and that group of investors or early people, and they have basic control of the company. Most of the DAOs out there right now are doing Cayman foundations. We're getting some interesting experimentation, but a lot of people are disappointed with them because really what they've done is they've created corporations that are probably more centralized than most legitimate corporations, but don't have to apply to labor laws and so forth. So it's understandable that people are upset because this isn't what you think of when you see the truly decentralized, successful DAOs. But the moment we start talking about like being in a DAO, like what does that even mean to you? Like, how are you in the DAO if it's decentralized? We've had decentralized organizing for a long time, right? It's how all companies interact with each other. So I always like to say, like, you're not in a DAO. You become an owner of your own destiny, and you choose to participate in decentralized and autonomous organizing. And that's where I think the value is.
I think that is a carryover from maybe the mental model people have of they work for a company. And so they just naturally translate that to, oh, now I work for a DAO. But it feels like it is a mindset shift in terms of the contributor because you don't work for a DAO in the same way you work for a company. I don't think it is a different structure. What do you think?
Yeah, I think fundamentally what we have are addresses, right? These are EOAs or contract addresses, and they hold some funds. And those funds are either controlled by one person or they're controlled by multiple people. You either have some mechanism with the many people when they want to jointly allocate some funds, we used to call this like a company or an LLC of some sort, where we're providing liability protection against the results of how they allocate or what promises they make. But to me, functionally, the decentralized autonomous organizing is about, if one address holds some funds, then there are people who want to be eligible to receive those funds, and there are people who have voice in saying who's eligible to receive those funds and how much they receive. Some people call this a grants program. Some people call this DAOs paying contributors. Essentially, it's all the same thing. It's a pool of funds which has its allocation decided by more than one person. Right now, we're sitting at this precipice where when we have more than one person, how do we make decisions? Well, one thing we can do is delegate authority to one person, right? Like we say, this person represents our idea the best. A lot of times that's a popularity contest more than it is a competency contest. Next, you might have a committee so that one person's ego runs away with it. What people don't realize is that is still a single point of failure. Like if you think like committees can't be bought off, look at like the clearinghouses before the financial crisis, right? It's one committee. You think it's decentralized because there's 6 people, but like it's still one committee. So the next way that we see this happen is that there's some mechanism which actually lets the direct voice of the participants decide on who gets a reward or an allocation or a grant or whatever you want to call it, gets paid as a contributor. These extend from things like quadratic funding, where your votes are based on the donations that you give, and we try to dampen the effect of the wealthy being able to buy out the round by using the square root of the total donation. There's quadratic voting, where you get credits and doesn't require an upfront capital. There's other mechanisms that people are trying to come up with. Like, for example, Hypersearch is looking at an idea around impact evaluations, where you reward evaluators and you review evaluators. The community reviews evaluators for how well they evaluate. So it's like a two-legged system of trust. And then you base your allocations on those evaluations. So there's all kinds of ways we can invent and create to try to have a collective decision. I think what we're trying to do here is like reach some higher resolution democracy where we feel like the will of the people is much more closely followed. We want to get away from, there's 800,000 people represented by one congressperson, and that person's voting for things that 90% of us don't want. We feel that in a decentralized world that shouldn't happen. However, in those decision-making tools, like I said, you're either going to delegate that authority to a single point of failure, you're going to delegate it to a committee, which is multiple people, but still a single point of failure, or you're going to create an open and permissionless protocol for how that works. I think that's why quadratic funding is so exciting, is it because it is like an open and permissionless protocol for doing that. But then there's all these other assumptions you bump up into that. So, we have to work through those to understand which of these mechanisms works best for allocating funds from a pool to potentially eligible receivers. Where do we have to step in and say, okay, we need to tighten the rules of who's eligible to receive. We need to tighten the rules of who's eligible to vote or how much vote weight they get. Those are the experiments we need to run before we can really make it decentralized and autonomous, where when new value is created, it goes into a pool and then it gets allocated between individuals and other pools. And each of those keeps allocating until eventually it gets to individuals, because the final purpose is that we want these incentives to be like sunlight acts on like a plant, right? It grows in the direction. We want to incite behavior change from humans. We want them to shift from defect first strategy to a cooperative strategy with the systems. And we're hoping that a little bit of incentive is enough to get them to change their behavior, or at least enough to cooperate that the system then is stable.
Often people who come to DAOs do so for ideological reasons, and they don't think as much about the practical structure. So a DAO does the same things as a corporation. It's just trying to do them in a different way. But it's still essentially trying to allocate work to people and compensating them for that work. Whatever mechanisms are in place are just a different way of doing that. I think the DAO structure can do well at protecting from internal corruption and exploitation, But quadratic funding
Yeah.
has the opposite problem, which is it's very easy for the users to distort the signals and twist it towards their own advantage. I think there are two difficulties with quadratic funding. The first is Sybil and collusion. So you tell me about the work we've done. I mean, I've done some of it too, but the work that you've led on helping protect quadratic funding against Sybil and collusion in GitCoin.
Yeah, I think, well, to start, the quadratic funding rounds on GitCoin have released over $50 million in fund allocation, and the fraud detection defense team has stopped over $3 million in fraudulent funding. And as a deterrent, we have no clue how much it deterred. And that isn't to say we caught all of it. This is something you can think of more like shrinkage in retail, where they know there's going to be some amount of theft, and at some point they could get a lower amount of theft, but it becomes inefficient. It's not worth the price paid to get that marginal gain. So what I think is really interesting about the Sybil thing is that if we knew that nobody had a second account, no individual human, well, then we know that the allocations of these funds would be optimal, because we would no longer need to decide which grants are fake because they're there to be Sybil attacked. But that wouldn't get rid of the collusion vector. So this might be like you and your friends all say, hey, we're each going to put up 1 grant of our own, and then we'll all vote for each other instead of us having put up only 1 grant or something along those lines, where then you're multiplying the effect of having that strong community all voting for them. There's a hard problem there where we don't know what the legitimate line is between corruption or collusion and coordination. If the hard rules of that protocol are saying that it would be better to do that with your friends, why wouldn't you go and do that? So this is a known problem, and I think that's like the next chapter of things that are going to be fought. I'm seeing a lot of really cool work around that. It started with the DSOC paper that Weil and Vitalik put out with a few others. Basically, they gave a K value, which is like the social distance between different voters. What that's saying is if we're looking at supporting public goods, things without a business model that we all need and can benefit from, something that you and I both vote for, and we're both from the US, that's interesting because there's multiple people voting for it. But is it more interesting if maybe you and I voted for the same highway to be built and the same school to be supported, but then we also voted for just clean air in general, right? Like a fund to innovate around like clean air solutions. Now, somebody in China, they also voted for a road and a school, but those were a different road and school, one that is in their public, closer to them. But they also voted into the clean air thing. Well, now what you've seen is cooperation across social distance, right? We're fairly far, both geographically, but also you can see by the other things we voted for, we don't have a lot of overlap. Therefore, this thing that across different communities was important to both groups should have more weight. So there's a lot of innovative math going on behind, well, how do we measure this social distance? And you might think of this as dampening collusion, the way pairwise modeling does, or you might think of it as incentivizing outgroup collaboration. It's literally incentivizing diversity in our public goods funding.
That's really interesting. And I think it's a really cool direction of research. And that's one problem that quadratic funding of public goods has to solve. And you hinted at the other one that I wanted to bring up, which was the definition of public goods. Because mimetically, the word public good is just so flawless. People love the idea of public and they love the idea of good. It's kind of like asking someone, do you support love? Like,
right.
Of course they do. But when you actually start to get into the details of what is a public good. So you gave a definition everyone needs or can benefit from that doesn't have a benefit of a business model. And there's a lot of stuff that people want to
everyone.
fund. Yeah.
Right. Who's everyone?
People want to have their projects funded. So people are often very elastic when it comes to the definition of what a public good is. Would you be willing to talk about your experience with that?
Well, when we're trying to think through funding true public goods, at the biggest level, you have things that are there for everybody, like clean air, let's say, maybe science, innovation. But even those could be applied like different convictions to different people that may or may not use that innovation in their life. What you come to find out is that public is a very relative term to the level at which you apply it. To give you a more concrete example of this, there's public goods of things that are available for everybody in the world, anybody alive, whatever, maybe in the universe. Then there's public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem. These are things that benefit everybody in the Ethereum ecosystem. Anybody could use them. Not necessarily all will use them, but they generally are collective wins. And then you say, okay, well, what about Uniswap? Uniswap may have been a public good in the Ethereum ecosystem when it was being built and didn't have a business model, and we didn't know if anybody would pay for it, right? So there was a high level of market risk for the entrepreneur building that. So the public good that was subsidized, it was originally funded. And at some point, that risk became less and less as the model was validated. And at this point, it doesn't need public goods funding. It's clearly a private good. However, it has an ecosystem of its own because anything that's open and permissionless has the ability, right? It has a natural commons that needs to be supported, or else it will fall prey to a free rider problem or tragedy of the commons in economics. This problem is like if you live with like two roommates, if the other person doesn't do the dishes when it's their turn, you can just kind of say, hey, you didn't do the dishes. But if you have 10 roommates, somebody's going to just kind of get away with not doing as much. And that means somebody else is taking on more than they should. It's not very fair. So to get over the free rider problem, we need to come up with different mechanisms that incentivize people to participate in a cooperative fashion, right? You might think of this as there's like three groups of people. There's people who are going to participate no matter what. They're going to do the damn dishes when it's their turn because that's what they do. Then there's people who, with a little push, if they know somebody's watching, will do the dishes. And there's those people who don't want to at all, ever. What we're trying to do is figure out, well, how do we get these people who don't want to do it at all to pay into a funding pool, which then properly allocates the reward for the people who are doing it for it to be fair, and enough reward for the people who sometimes don't do it, that they more often cooperate and do it, and they change that behavior. So when we talk about the public in the public good, it's in relation to what is that collective group. I always liken it to this, like, I think it was a Nassim Taleb quote where he's like, in my home, I'm a communist. We all share. But like with my extended family, I'm more of a socialist. And by the time we get all the way out to my country, I'm a libertarian.
I resonate with that because I'm an anarchist. But I mean, my family has my house. First of all, an anarchist doesn't mean you don't have rules. It means you don't have archism. In my family, we have a pretty clear structure and we have rules. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about just on that topic, but I want to move away from it. Other than to say, I really like one thing you've mentioned in the past, which is there's very little risk in exploring these models because they're not coercive. So if GitCoin were going to be like the law of the land enforced by the police in the US, I would be against it. Right. But if I don't like it, I can just not participate. I can go to another project or another ecosystem. The fact that you can vote with your feet or vote with your dollars or vote with your time is another form of decision making. And because that decision making is available, it means that it's I like it a lot more than doing things through governmental organizations that have police powers.
Yeah, it's a right to exit, right? Fundamentally, anything that uses enforcement is playing a game. It's like the game is, if productivity is running, then what the game you're playing is trying to knock down the people next to you so they don't pass you up, versus running as fast as you can and seeing how fast you can individually perform. I do think that in governance, the consent to the governed is a very funny thing, because a democracy fundamentally means that half the people are rightfully pissed off all the time, right? So it's like you want to say that 90% of the people are basically like happy with the decisions. But if the majority of people are happy and it's working out, then we go find something new to fight about, right? And argue about. And those are always going to be close to like 50-50 things. Now, nobody moved to Canada when Trump was elected, like they said they would, or at least not many people, because they had all these other things tied in with that one value. And so if an ecosystem on coin is doing something like, let's say there's a climate ecosystem and they don't have an appeal system, and there's all these people who've been kicked out, their grants aren't allowed, and you're like, why am I donating to this one? I could just donate directly to the grants I like and not be doing this funding pool, or I could donate to a different funding pool and run a different set of rules. And this is how we program our values into our money. Fundamentally, what this does is it lets us isolate the values such that people who govern pools of funding, they become servants trying to optimize and work to find what the citizenry, the customers want. So there's like this idea out of like a sovereign individual around like governments will need to solicit the citizens as customers. It's like, well, these different mechanisms or governance models for funding the public goods in across GitCoin, those are each a representation of a set of values. So if you fork that set of values and you're going to change one rule about it, now you have like a choice here where not a lot has changed, but there's something very specifically changing. I think our ability to hold value in the system that matches our values is literally what makes it so like our values then create the value. Now that's not happening. It sort of does. Your dollar's backed by the full faith and trust of the United States government, which we begrudgingly give consent to. But what if we could express our values literally as value without the middleman of that government layer? So the mechanism that allows somebody to fork, to exit, and to do that incrementally with small changes of the code, the way when Bitcoin updates its code or Ethereum, it's like new people have to run that code and it's one constraint up or down on the rule set that changes. I think that's a very, very powerful primitive. And we're starting to see that value, but I don't think most people are rocking what that allows us to do yet.